In this module on supply and demand, we'll be looking at recorded during the coronavirus lockdown in New York City in March 2020. We're looking at supply and demand in the market for rental housing in New York City. Gregory Mankiw, again, the chair of the Harvard Economics Department, did a survey of the members of the American Economic Association and found that 93% of economists agree that a ceiling on rents reduces the quantity and quality of housing available. So if 93% of economists agree on that, then we ask ourselves, well, why does the state intervene if it's known that it creates less housing and worse housing? Are those intended or unintended consequences of interventions? So let's look at the market for rental housing in New York City. Start with perfect competition. Everybody who wants housing, rental housing in New York City is able to get rental housing. Everybody who's further along in their life cycle, economic life cycle, who owns property is able to rent that property. Let's say that the market clearing price for rental housing in New York City is $1,000 per room, for example. Again, you're aggregating, and every neighborhood's different, so that's the aggregation fallacy. But we use in economics, we use abstracted models as knowledge heuristics to understanding basic principles of economics. So everybody who wants housing in New York City is able to get it. Everyone who wants to rent housing is able to do so. So then we ask ourselves, why does the state intervene? And there's many known and unknown reasons of why you have rent control or rent stabilization in New York City. I'm not sure. I wasn't there when it was created. One thing I heard was that it was in order to make housing affordable for those coming back from World War II. Another thing I heard is that the landlords in New Jersey bribed the New York City Council to put in rent control so that then land values in New Jersey would increase. So for whatever reason, we have rent control in New York City. And New York City is not alone, of course. San Francisco, Berlin put in a moratorium on rent increases. So housing building has virtually stopped in Berlin because they put on rent control. But so let's say that in this case, you have $1,000 per room market clearing rent for rental housing. And this $1,000 includes, for the landlord, for the supplier of rental housing, they have to pay a mortgage. So they make a profit, entrepreneurial profit, but they still have to pay this mortgage. Right. And also the upkeep on the apartment as part of the costs of supplying the property. So then we ask ourselves, why would you put on the rent control we know from Hayek, 1945, Use of Knowledge in Society, that oftentimes when you intervene into the local and decentralized price signal, that brings social crisis. And what that does, it creates homelessness. The price control in the housing market creates less property, worse maintained property, as well as homelessness. So let's look at that. So here's the market clearing price. Now, politicians like to intervene and promise things to people to get votes. So they will say, oh, the rent's too damn high in New York City. Let's do something about it. We'll put in a rent control so that landlords don't exploit renters, right? Even though landlords need renters just as much as renters need landlords. Anyway, the politicians gain because they can promise pandering to constituents. So what happens is you put in a price control. In this case, a rent ceiling. I before E except after C. Price control rent ceiling in the market for rental housing in New York City. And what happens is the supply for housing goes down while the demand for housing increases. And so one of the reasons that the supply of housing goes down is because the landlords can no longer afford to pay the rent, to pay the mortgage. So landlords can't cover their costs, so they're willing to supply less rental housing. And also, the reason you get worse quality housing is because landlords now aren't getting enough rent to maintain the properties. And in fact, it got so bad, I believe in the 1970s, I wasn't here then, in the 1970s in New York City, in the Bronx, that landlords were actually burning down their property so they could get insurance. That's an example of Hayek's social crisis of intervention. So the supply of housing goes down, the demand for housing goes up. So what you end up with is homelessness. Or people moving to New Jersey to rent houses, for rental housing. So the demand for New Jersey property goes up due to the New York City rent controls. Also who gains are vested interests. People who already are landlords, and then when you're putting on rent control, there'll be less new rental housing built, and therefore then those already in business then make above normal profits. That's called regulatory capture, or the vested interests like to keep things the way they are so that they can get their above normal profits. So the price control in the housing market creates less housing, worse quality housing, and it creates homelessness. And if you were really cynical, you would say that politicians, and bureaucrats and technocrats, those people who work for the city, in this case, enforcing rental control, enforcing minimum wage, it creates in general, public labor unions workers make more than the general public. Labor union workers make more money than do the general public. So the intervention enforcement effects helps the bureaucrats and the technocrats working for the city. And it also, if you really want to be cynical, the homelessness then creates a demand for public housing. So you get public housing built, which then helps the labor unions who build the public housing, and then the city officials who manage the public housing. Right. So here's Hayek's use of knowledge in society, where he, in 1945, published in the American Economic Review, where he talks about distortion of the price signal causes social crisis. And let's see what else we got. And we also did a hard fire TV show on why rent is so high in New York City, where we got into other issues besides just rent control, things like zoning laws and other types of regulation and other types of market distortions, which can help explain homelessness and high rents and high costs in New York City. So that completes our module on the supply and demand for rental housing. And thank you.